Testing, testing. Hello. Is that all right, Sam? Can you hear me if I'm reading like this? Perfect.
Welcome everyone. If you're still coming in at the back, do take a seat, and we're just about to start shortly. I'm Becky Swain, the director here at Manchester Poetry Library, and I just wanted to welcome you to a fantastic evening with Michael Symmons Roberts launching a new poetry collection, and we're extremely excited that it is the kind of upfront headline for our season, our spring-summer season. And it is actually warm enough to use the word spring or summer today. And thank you very much for joining us. A couple of things to tell you. If you haven't been here before, I do recognise a few faces, but if you haven't, we're not expecting a fire drill. If there is one, you just come out the way you came in and across to the main portico columned entrance, and we just convene in All Saints Square. And if you need the loos, they're just out of the entrance here and on your right. And we're here till 8-ish tonight. If you'd like to help yourself to drinks, we've got cupcakes to launch the new season too. And don't be shy, do help yourself to things. So without further ado, I want to pass on to our programme manager, Martin Kratz. Obviously, we're a public poetry library, and what makes that different than a university library is that our programme needs to consider all of our members, and it needs to be as eclectic as possible. It also responds to the research and education staff that we have here at Manchester Met. And Michael Symmons Roberts, we are very, very privileged to say, is one of our colleagues here at Manchester Met, as is Jean, who's with us tonight too. So Martin Kratz is our programme manager. Martin puts together an amazing spring-summer programme and then autumn-winter programme here at Manchester Poetry Library. And he's going to go through some of the highlights that you can look forward to between now and July. So Martin, over to you.
Okay, sorry, just working something out there. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good evening, everyone who's joining us online as well. I'm going to start with a poem. I like to wear something encouraging to myself whenever I'm standing in front of people. This is my lapwing jumper, which I only like to wear during lapwing season. But because it gets warm in the summer, there's a very narrow window for it. And today I thought, I think it might just about be lapwing season now. So I put it on. And as the bus drove over the moors, I saw my first lapwings of the year. And partly that and partly the programme generally put me in mind of spring. And I thought about a poem to read. And I thought of Du Fu, the 8th century Chinese poet. And I was thinking, maybe I thought of him about spring. Also, I think a lot of people are sort of turning to him as a writer, partly because he's sort of one of the oldest poets on kind of war and displacement and migration. So this is a translation which was published last year in the Poetry Review by Kit Fan and Hugh Horton, called Spring, Remembering Li Bai. And in the background, it is a spring poem, but in those other themes are there in the background if you listen really carefully. Li Bai, your poems have no enemy. They move with wind and flow with water. They think independently, dew fresh as Keats's and handsomer than Eliot's. Even trees north of the river are dreaming of spring. Even clouds east of the river are speculating on the sun. When will we share a carafe while meticulously criticizing each other's poetry? This is, of course, available in our collection. So our last programme was Night Vision, and I recognise a lot of people who will have come to events for that. And the new programme is based on the theme Elemental. Night Vision comes to an end. It was a great programme, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But the kind of combining factor is Jean, because Night Vision was based on her nonfiction book, and Elemental will be based on the new poetry collection, Goyle, Chert, Meyer. And the collection and the exhibition that will be on from April and by extension the programme, I think, kind of follows poetry in the way it often begins in the attention to the physical before turning to the act of naming and the elemental quality of language itself, how it forms not just poetry, but our whole world. And in the last programme, we looked at darkness as something endangered, and in fact, the very last event we did as part of that programme was the Endangered Languages Festival in the Holden Gallery, and that's how we concluded it. But since then, in the meantime, the Earth's tilt has brought us lengthening days, lapwings and sunshine, and perhaps maybe a bit more capacity to think about resilience in light of all this. I'm not going to tell you what's in the programme. You can look yourselves. I'm going to mention a few things at the end, but this is my chance to do the proper thank yous to all my colleagues, academics, the writers and the artists involved, to Rachel, James and Jake, who've been involved with the design and marketing of it, to all the students, both those who are here just using the library, but also our Poetry Library ambassadors, such as the three at the back, who help us run the events and give us ideas, the Poetry Library team, Becky Swain, Kate Chu and Deborah Witch, the Manchester Writing School and the School of English, Poetry Research Group at Manchester Met, Centre for Place Riding. No, we haven't got stables yet. Centre for Place Writing. Is that an idea for expansion? Okay, maybe you heard it here first. Centre for Place Writing coming. Centre for Place Writing for supporting us ahead for the funding of the programme. Manchester City of Literature. The Library Experience team, the LEAs who work in this library every day. I've just pointed out Andrew is the sole representative there. But also, in fact, by extension, the whole library team. Sam Heitzman and Will Holton, who help us with the tech, and John Campbell and Adam Butler in tech services, as well as facilities, who move the chairs in and out almost constantly in response to my volley of requests as more and more events happen. That's a lot of people and a lot of thank yous, but it takes a lot for a programme to come together. And without any one of them, this wouldn't be happening. And ultimately, thank you. We want to know from you what you want to see. We've just had loads of responses to our survey, and we're just thinking about that now. So we'll be kind of publishing a response, hopefully soon. But we're still open to hearing from you. So if you have any questions, come find me or Becky or Kay and Deborah, who will identify themselves somehow. Deborah will wave, Kay somewhere, I don't know. But that's it. So the final thing before I pass over to Jean and Michael is, if you enjoyed tonight, we have another event at 6 p.m. on Friday with poet Kate Lord-Brown and Tina Cole. Daljit Nagra is here on Tuesday. And on Wednesday and Thursday, we have the Manchester Translation Series. And the one thing I want to say about the Manchester Translation Series, you don't need another language and you need no experience in creative writing or translation. Feel free to come along. It's always a really good event and great conversations. So in the meantime, it gives me great pleasure, and I'd like you to join me in a huge round of applause to welcome Michael Symmons Roberts and Jean Sprackland.
Much, Martin, and I know Martin's just been through a whole list of thanks there, but he also needs to be thanked. The Poetry Library is a kind of, I say it every time, it's an incredible place. It's a place that would be incredible even without the programme of events. But the thing is, it's not just a library. It is a vibrant centre for events, for people, for the public, for students, for all of us. And it's very close to my heart, and I know to Michael's as well. It goes back a long way for both of us. So thank you, Martin, and everyone at the Poetry Library for having us here this evening. So it is, I'm Jean Sprackland, I'm Professor of Creative Writing here at Manchester Met, and it is my huge privilege and also my huge pleasure to be hosting this event, introducing Michael's new books, and talking to him about these books and about his writing practice, and also we're going to kind of intersperse that chat with some readings of poems and also of prose, because Michael's two books here, as you probably know, this is the brand new poetry collection Dog Star, hot off the press, really beautiful in every way, outside and in, as they sometimes say. Beautiful outside and in. And it coincides with the paperback edition of this prose book, this non-fiction book, Quartet for the End of Time. And so we're going to talk first about the poetry book, but then we're going to kind of involve the prose book as well and think about some of the connections between them maybe. It's always a heavy responsibility, I feel, to introduce somebody at an event. It's one of the most nerve-wracking things because you really want to do the right thing by them, to do it well, to honour them. But it's also possible to do it in a very boring way by just listing all the books they've published and all the awards they've won. And I feel as if you can actually get all of that from Wikipedia. So I'm sort of not going to do it. I'm not going to go on about the 9 collections of poetry, the 3 works of non-fiction, the 2 novels, the libretto, the broadcasting, the drama, all the awards, the Forward Prize, the Costa Award, the Jerwood Prize. I'm just not going to linger on any of those. I'm going to start by saying that I met Michael, I think, in 2003, which, you know, is a frighteningly long time ago. We had and have the same poetry editor at Cape. It was probably him who introduced us at some Poetry World event. Neither of us can remember what. But I know it was around then because I already knew his work. And in particular, I knew his book Burning Babylon, which some of you will have read, which I think came out in 2001. Yes. And which I found really distinctive and striking and unforgettable. It's about a particular place. It's about Greenham Common, close to where Michael spent some of his formative years. And I knew that place because I'd been involved in a small way in the women's peace movement in my late teens. So there was a kind of very solid anchoring to the real in that book. But what a very particular place. What a kind of terrifying and urgent place to write about. And what struck me then was what has continued to strike me as I've read his work over the years, this kind of bringing together of the intensely physical with the other, with the metaphysical, the spiritual, whatever we might want to call it. That's been a sort of defining characteristic of Michael's work over the years, I think. We've been friends ever since. We've been colleagues for 16 years. And I've always hugely looked forward to his new work coming out. Another favourite poem that some of you will know, which is in Corpus, which I think came out in 2004, is the poem Pelt. Some of you probably remember this one. Again, it's kind of once read, never forgotten. You know, the world has been, I think the word is fleeced in the poem, a wonderfully ambiguous word. Its skin has been taken off and it's left kind of raw and weeping and wounded. And this pelt has been nailed up on a hotel wall. And it ends with this marvellous line, kind of almost throwaway, but lingers in the mind, this line. I tried it on, of course, but no. And then later, his collection Dry Salter, which had this series of hymns in it, but they were hymns to very ordinary human things like a roller coaster and a factory and a karaoke machine. So again, there was this sense that this engagement with the spiritual was always connected to not only to the physical, but to the ordinary and perhaps overlooked stuff of human life. It's not the easiest thing at this time in history to write about the soul, to speak of the soul, to even find a language in which to think about it. And this is, I think, something that Michael really excels in. You know, we live in this very polarized time, don't we? We've had some interesting events going on here today outside the building, with some very extreme views being kind of shouted through a megaphone. You know, it seems difficult not to be caught up in that very polarized kind of, I hesitate to call it debate, between matters of faith, if you like, and the secular. Both positions seem to be very aggressive at the moment. But this is a place where Michael really excels at being, and a language that he excels at finding. And this is what the treat that we're in for tonight when we hear some of the work from this new book. So I'm going to start with a little bit of introductory chat with Michael and then ask you to read some poems, if that's all right. Sure. So your new book, welcome, congratulations.
Thank you.
It is very beautiful. It's called Dog Star. And I suppose my first thought when I saw that title was that there is a star, isn't there, called the Dog Star. Mm. It's a very, very bright star, I think. Mm-hmm. Sirius?
Yes.
Its name is Sirius. And I know that there's a poem in the book that directly, where you directly speak about that star. Mm. But actually the cover image of the book has a different kind of star on it. You probably, I don't know if you've seen the cover or whether you can see from here, but there's an image there which is a plant of some kind.
It's a rose.
Is it really?
An ex-rose. It's a dead rose.
Ah. Yeah. Okay, that is interesting. Yes, I wondered exactly what it was. I don't think it says. But I guess I thought about these two stars that I had in my mind, the one in the sky, the one in the heavens, if you like, the one on the earth. And I thought, you know, is there something here about these two images or these two ideas of star that kind of helps us to think about what the main themes and concerns of this book are?
It's you will know, any of you who write will know that you never have complete control over your imagery or the poems that are going to come to you. So this was an idea that grew out of the poems that I was writing towards this book. And I think the idea, there are lots of dogs in my poems. I just can't get away from it. So I was once told I write a lot about dogs and cars. I don't think there are any cars in this one. Oh yeah, there is one actually. But there's a dogs feature. So there's something about the name Dog Star that appealed to me, and the implications of faithfulness and a kind of profound relation to something to do with the natural world. But Dog Star also has ancient mythic properties, the dog star as being a good or bad omen, and the whole idea of dog days, the dog days of summer, the overheated, you can't move, you can't do anything, you're parched, is to do with Sirius being too close and sticking around too long in the sky. So it felt quite rich imagistically, but it was actually in writing that poem, which I'm going to read later, that the dog star seemed just naturally kind of dropped in. And almost as soon as it dropped into the poem, I thought, actually, that could be the title. And then the other thing just to mention is the cover image came to me virtually as soon as the title came to me, because it's beautiful and it looks like a star. It's actually the remnants of a dead flower, as I was saying. And this came out of a collaboration with the Scottish photographer Norman Macbeath, whose work I've admired hugely for years. And we were put to work together with a kind of open brief, you know, write about anything that you both want to write about. And so we picked up on each other's preoccupations. And he was doing lots of work, really close up, black and white, beautiful images of I suppose, death, or the end, the kind of end of the life of a flower or a plant, or bones, animal bones in the grass. They're stunningly beautiful and semi-abstract. They're so close up. And so I had that idea that one of these could be the star-like image on the front of Dog Star. So it all kind of coalesced at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the themes in the book, you know, the ones that kind of rose to the surface first for me, I guess, as I read, were nature and the human place in it, mortality, grief. There's a long elegy in the book to your mother, love, and there are recurring motifs, recurring words, birds. There may only be one dog, but there are loads of birds in this book. Yeah. Also light and dark, which of course I particularly noticed because it's been my subject recently. Hearts. There are a lot of hearts in the book. And the word love comes in again and again. And I guess, you know, I'm thinking that in my own kind of process of putting a book of poems together, I don't always notice these recurrences until some way through the process. I wonder how that is for you. I think there might be an idea on the part of some readers that it's all kind of mapped out in advance, and you know that you kind of go about this in a kind of very conscious and deliberate way, repeating these motifs, these ideas. But how is it for you? Do you find that you are sometimes surprised by these recurrences in your own work?
Not just sometimes. I mean, it's a chaotic process, as I think most of the poets I know, all of the poets I know who I've talked to about this, have the similar sense that they wish they could consider it as a project and plan it and map it. And the poems just don't go along with that. They won't let you do it. So I find, I mean, I came from, my sort of day job for years was as a documentary filmmaker. And so I was taught how to construct narratives in the edit. You film all these hours of material and then you construct the thing. And I think I always thought, well, one day I'll be able to apply that to these books of poems. And it just never works. And I think it's good that it doesn't work as well. It sort of slips through your fingers, and that's the sign that it might be taking you somewhere new or more interesting, don't you think? So there's, I find it differs from book to book, but first of all, I'm just writing individual poems or strands of poems or sequences. And I try not to ask of them, what are you becoming, until about halfway through, 3/4 of the way through the book. And then I'll read through them all, and some of them might have been written months and months before, years before. And so at that point, you're almost seeing them anew. And then I'll think, okay, this is what you're doing. You've got this thread in, and I didn't know I was doing this. But then, so the last clutch of poems for me in the book, I'm conscious of what the book is. Up until then, it's anyone's guess.
Yeah. And of course, whatever's going on for you at the time in your own conscious and unconscious mind, in your life, gets in and casts the poems in a different light from the one you intended them or how they began. I'm thinking particularly about that elegy for your mother, Elliptics, which I understand was originally responding to a different kind of brief. It was written as a libretto for a composer who I believe we have in the
Emily, who's here
in the audience tonight, Emily, and then kind of became something else as you wrote it.
It did. I'm going to read that at the end in the second part, so you'll hear this poem, Elliptics. It's in 11 sections, and there are numbers throughout it, but Emily and I have worked together before. We were commissioned by the Manchester International Festival to do a piece to commemorate the anniversary of the Peterloo massacre. So that was our first piece together. And then we wanted to work together again. And so we started from the basic. I think if you're a poet who's working with composers, as I have been lucky enough to do quite a lot over the last few decades, you try and produce a text that meets the composer halfway in some sense. And Emily has a degree in mathematics, and part of the way that Emily thinks about music is through mathematical structures and patterns. So I thought, well, I've always been interested in the idea of poems starting from somewhere abstract, so we'll pick a number. So we picked 11, because it's quite an unusual number to write about. And I thought I can get quite a lot of words riff off that, including the title, elliptics. So I was thinking, yeah, maybe we could have some fun with this, and I could put patterns of 11 in the poems. But this was all in the months following the death of my mother, and the death of my father was about a couple of years before that. And this thing kept becoming an elegy primarily to my mother, having written one for my father a few years before. And I kept thinking, no, it's got to be abstract. This has got to be abstract. And then it was sort of abstract, and then she would appear in it in some kind of guise. And so in the end, I came back to, this is the composer Emily Howard. I don't know whether I said her surname, but so I came back to Emily and said, this is not really abstract at all. It's an elegy for my mum. And she went with it and set it. So I was very, very grateful for Emily sort of meeting me halfway on that. So yes, they're slippery things, poems, and I think you have to meet them halfway in some sense as well, because as you rightly point out, what you're preoccupied by comes into them whether you want them or not. There's a famous line in an interview by Philip Larkin when he said he wanted to be a beautiful nature poet, writing lyrical poems about the landscape, which he loved. But he said, I just can't do it when I can't write them. I sit down and other things come out. You know, his famous sort of misery or cynicism or whatever you'd like to term it. So he ends up saying in that interview, you don't write the poems you want to write. And I think that's a sort of miserabilist twist on it. I would say your poems surprise you by not writing what you think you're writing. And I see that as quite a positive thing. So if you're really serious about making poems, you're not writing about something you preordained or already thought through, because if you have, what is the point in doing this really odd thing of writing a poem about it? So you've got a hunch about something and you're exploring it and you're seeing where it takes you. And of course, because it's you that's making this thing, you pull all the preoccupations and the things that are going around in your head and heart into it, whether you like it or not. So that's my experience anyway. Yeah.
That's great. So we're going to hear that poem later, Elliptics, but would you like to read us some poems now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Martin. Thank you. So I'll begin with one of the poems, the many poems about birds that Jean was referring to earlier. I thought at one stage this was going to be a book entirely about birds, with titles being the birds' names. And it's ended up with, I think this is probably the only one that has the title of the birds as the bird's name. There's a heavy influence on the way I'm writing about birds in this book from the other book, Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, because he had a particular, very strange philosophy of what birds were. So I can talk about that a bit afterwards. But so, Eurasian blackbird. You dark of plumage, darker still of voice, denizen of deepest wild woods, you who drew yourself through countless generations into gardens and suburban parks. Primeval singer with a modern repertoire, you showy, you sassy, you spindrift, you priest who starts an evensong across this continent in spring, you sunbather on dry-baked lawns, splayed like a broken paper fan, cat's crime scene, you whose eye I must not catch for fear of being pulled in through the halo, then your honeycomb iris into the negative space where a pupil should be, where you hold the old woods, dense and slow with song. All beasts, shadows, shafts of sun, distilled into a ripe full stop. If you scare now while I'm in there, I will never leave. This is a poem that I at the time thought was more abstract than it turned out to be. There are a lot of trees in this book as well. And this is about a sumac, which is that weird, they're like furry sort of antlers, the branches of a sumac. And we had one near us when I was growing up, which I used to climb in sometimes. I'd never really thought about it much, and it came back into this poem. And like a number of the poems in here, it ended up as a kind of elegy. I realized afterwards, oh, okay, this is about my mum. Sumac. In a back street between warehouses, fly-tipped tires and oil drums, walls falling into the square they denote, this single relic of a long-gone garden, staghorn trunk and boughs, part beast, part plant, low enough to climb in, too perfect to fell. A car idles in the next yard. Crow on a rooftop picks at its breast. A woman climbs down from the sumac, brushing herself off, hunched and crooked, clothes covered in moss, worn thin. She has been up there since childhood, when this was still a garden. Someone is calling her back to the house because everyone is waiting at the table. Up beyond, the loud wild rises. This is one of those poems about hearts that Jean was talking about. Has anyone come across the word saliter? S-A-L-I-T-T-E-R. You might have come across it if you've read Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It actually came from a tangent of the research I was doing for the Quartet for the End of Time book, which is about a composer, 20th century composer, Olivier Messiaen. I can say more about him later, but he wrote his most famous piece of music in a labor camp, German labor camp, during the Second World War. And the only other famous person that's ever come out of this town, Görlitz, was the old mystic Jakob Böhme, 17th century mystic, who is still revered in Lutheranism, but not read much here. The idea of the saliter originally comes from Jakob Böhme, and what he meant was something like the essence of God. The before anything is created, just this essence, which is like the primary material of creation. And in Cormac McCarthy's The Road, when the father and child are walking down the road, at one point, I think it's the father says, he sees the saliter there with the kind of, the fumes rising off it, like it's sort of discarded petrol or something. And there's no notes explaining where he got this. And I thought someone must have written about this, and the internet is full of people guessing what saliter means and what he meant by it. It was kind of slightly mischievous, but I like the idea of him dropping it in and not doing anything. I put a note in the back of my book. So this is called saliter. Last snow salts the tails of bullfinches blushed pink with cold. On every roof alike it lands with tenderness as if to dress a wound. In our blanked out road, a patch of rock salt with a cast of rust opens like a rose. Under dead skies, a heart grows in this thaw, too hot to hold, cut and bruised. A shaking, naked heart, too bulbous for a bird's, too modest to keep a horse in blood. It must be yours, this gift, left outside your house. Listen, this is hope, the meat of it, saliter, essence of life, of love, ungovernable electricity, the stuff of us, not drying out, but thawing. Take it. For an instant, the astonishment cuts through, then melts away. So another presence behind this book was the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, who died during the years of Stalinist persecution. His story, I was commissioned to dramatize his story for BBC Radio, and in the process of that, I returned to a love of his poems, which I had since I was about 18, and bought the Penguin Classics edition of his book with this incredible picture of him when a young man, really powerful and arresting, and sort of all of his swagger that got him into such trouble was there in this photograph. So I returned to him and was captivated again by the poems and started writing what I can only describe as, they weren't translations, they weren't versions of his work, they were sort of riffs off his poems, taking a starting point from his poems and then making them into different poems. So I thought, I can't really call these Mandelstam versions or Mandelstam translations. And the only other Mandelstam I'd ever heard of, although I don't understand what he did, was Stanley Mandelstam. I think I was intrigued because I heard the name. He's a scientist. He was a theoretical physicist. And I thought, I wonder if they're related. And I couldn't find a link. But Stanley Mandelstam developed a way of coding particles in scatter patterns. And I thought, particles and scatter patterns sounds a bit like what I was doing with these poems. So, and that particular method of coding he called Mandelstam variables. So I thought, that's what I'll call these poems. They're Mandelstam variables. So I'm going to read 3 of those now, very different. Mandelstam's probably most famous poem, translated into English, and published in America and here, is about a goldfinch. So I thought I had to write about a goldfinch at some point when I was doing these. Where are you, and what are the chances of a visitation to lift this God-forsaken brutish day? A gold blow-in clump, a gust-cut cloud of seed clocks caught in the crab apple's fingertips. Rarely seen alone, goldfinch wonder clusters glow at midnight in the city's perma light. What's the weather like in your eyes? Behind your forehead, you hold no wheel of colors, but millennia of harmonics. A hard-won, hard-wired catalogue of tunes, so tough to sing that you would sooner parrot songs of any neighbor. Come back to us. We miss you, your blood-dipped face, inverse pearl eyes. I'll wait the night and watch, petition you, and look, the sourpuss tree in April has held back its tulle and tissue pinks, which while it augurs badly means a chance for me to pick you out, rare baubles in the branch-top jackstraws. But these words contain their own negation. For every goldfinch put into a poem, one will vanish from the world outside. As I said, he was exiled, he was persecuted, he was imprisoned during the era of persecution. And some of his poems deal with that directly, some less directly. And there's one poem, famous poem of his, where it's addressed to the person he thinks is listening to him, is eavesdropping on him with malign intent. So this is a riff off that. Hello, you in the headphones. Did you learn your trade from bats, or even better, wax moths who outshrill the shrillest bat, or dolphins, or dogs? Do you get benchmarked for surveillance skills, double pay when you graduate from owl to rat? These exile nights will never leave me, wired in to a half-tuned radio, waiting for the time signal at the top of each hour. Has spring come where you are? Buds letting go their winter clench? I can out-listen you. However hard you strain at me, I hold you in the silence between my finger and my thumb, and I can hear you squirm. This is another one which starts in his apartment when the forces against him are closing in. And I start with some of the imagery that's there in the original poem and then move away from it. Mute as unprinted paper, this apartment, bare walls, nothing personal. Any fools could live here. Only the radiator's indigestion breaks our vow of silence, though we can't recall the reason why we made it. All is immaculate, calm, all except the telephone, a squat frog ever primed to leap. Our few possessions hate the place. They long to leave. And me? I play tunes for invisible ears, teach goldfinch riffs to killers. My reading is ration books. My listening is speeches by the dead. My songs are screams dressed as salves. I am an artist. I work from life. I am a moth caught in a fist. I am the salt left in a pan. And I'll read one more for this bit. This is called Soliloquy of a Focus Puller. Stone with a stone pushed into it, then a single clay bead, then a string, an hourglass, broken barometer stuck on very dry and still, dome loop to get up close, pinned up postcard of a man of sorrows, green-skinned, distended belly, hands nailed to his breast, pianist's hands like capsized crabs, rib ladder up towards the face, nestling to its shoulder blade, a shoulder to cry on, scapula, scalpel, brow pulled to a skein above the wishbone of his nose, eyes dark and pitted as bad fruit, and nothing to show for it, caught in the act of trying to cry. But it is all too much, a motion blur, cacophony. If only we could see, not far, but wider, out of frame, a river after dark, row of black poplars, then domes and towers of a city, all the people in their finery. The water is alive, the jewels in it, then wider, further, out and out.
Thanks, Michael. That was great. And really interesting to hear you talking there about Mandelstam and this kind of playful, slightly naughty, I think, kind of bringing, or you know, confusion for the reader, possibly, between these two Mandelstams. So there's no relationship between them. No. Yeah, interesting. And it made me think about other influences and what we might think of as kind of presiding spirits in this book. One of the most obvious of those perhaps is D.H. Lawrence.
Yeah.
And particularly his book, Birds, Beasts and Flowers, which seems to just infiltrate your own work here. I wonder how you kind of got into dialogue with him in particular in this book, and whether that's a new thing for you.
A lot of these things come in through not necessarily, it suddenly occurs to me I want to read them, but I'm working on something else, and that takes you there. So D.H. Lawrence was someone I read in my teens, as lots of people do, you know, and I also remember seeing the film of Women in Love and thinking this is extraordinary. And then for all sorts of reasons that we needn't go into, he became unfashionable, and then beyond unfashionable, like no one wanted to talk about D.H. Lawrence. And there were some good reasons for that, to do with the way he depicts women and so on. But what happened in recent years, maybe in the last, I suppose, 5 years in particular, was a group of women working separately, academics, novelists, and biographers, got together and said, okay, there's something really important in D.H. Lawrence, and it feels really timely. And so that was mainly about the novels. So suddenly they were back, and at various universities, D.H. Lawrence was back on the curriculum and so on. So there's been a complicated about term. On the back of that, I was asked by Radio 4 to do a series about D.H. Lawrence for those who didn't know his work, you know. And I said, well, okay, I can do that, but I really come at it from the poems. So they let me do it, but it meant I went back to his collected poems. Now, if you've seen D.H. Lawrence's collected poems, they are vast. I mean, it could keep a heavy door open, his collected poems. And quite a lot of them, when you read through, you think, he's just shouting at me. He's a great ranter. But then you get these moments where his focus locks onto something, particularly in that extraordinary purple patch around the book of poems, Birds, Beasts and Flowers, which were mainly written quite late in his life. He died quite young of tuberculosis, but quite late in his life, and mainly in, some of them in Mexico, New Mexico, but mainly in Florence and the hills around Florence. And he'll just respond to a tree or a goat or a bird, but with real intensity, not just the sort of poet finds a subject, you know, describes a subject, but really powerful, trying to get into, I suppose, the soul of this tree or whatever. So some of these are among the most famous poems, I would say, of the 20th century, and have influenced lots and lots of poets. So I went back to them, and then again, you don't know you're being influenced until after the event, do you? And then I thought, why did it seem natural for the Blackbird poem to be addressed to you, rather than that sort of slightly distant, you know, I am describing a blackbird? And I think with hindsight, yeah, it came from him. But it was more than that. When I started writing and publishing poems, I guess in the 80s and 90s, British poetry started to become beset with a sort of self-protective masking or irony. Everything had to be ironized and protected, and you would always give a sort of slightly underhand payoff at the end of a poem, so you weren't running the risk of being taken too seriously with big claims or anything. Birds, Beasts and Flowers really doesn't do that. It's like the opposite. And in some ways that's infuriating. You know, he makes very big claims, but the passion in them is very, I think, infectious and feels quite countercultural. So I guess that sort of got under my skin in a way and found its way into the poems.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting that you mention that direct address.
Yeah.
Because when I went back to Lawrence's poems, you know, thinking about tonight, that's one of the things I noticed was that he quite often addresses a creature in a very direct and kind of intimate way. Like he's on really close terms with this creature. So there's a poem called Mosquito, which starts, "When did you start your tricks, monsieur?" You know, it's like, it's a very particular kind of tone of voice and suggestion of relationship, I suppose. And then, you know, I went back, I thought, oh, right. And I went back to your poem that you've read for us, Eurasian Blackbird. You showy, you sassy, you spindrift. And I thought, yeah, that's the thing when you're kind of influenced by another poet. It's not only the sort of perhaps more obvious, tangible things of a particular form or a little technical thing that you get from that poet. It's tonal as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it can sometimes be tone. It can sometimes be it seems to challenge you to do something slightly different, or it. But I think anyone who writes has a constellation of what you could call influences, other presences, some of them going back to the first people that got you wanting to write anyway, and some of them just people, it could be a single poem you've read in a magazine recently that was written 2 months ago, but it all adds to this sort of huge swirling kind of constellation of other presences that prod you in one direction or another. And I think we all find this, and they're not all poems either. There's a big presence behind the poems in Dog Star, I subsequently realised, from a book about 4 philosophers that I read during this same period of writing.
This is Metaphysical Animals.
It's Metaphysical Animals. So it's a book, it got a lot of attention, quite rightly. Claire McCormill and Rachel Wiseman, 2 contemporary philosophers, wrote a book called Metaphysical Animals, which was about 4 philosophers, Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley, and Elizabeth Anscombe, who arrived into Oxford to study philosophy at a time when it was dominated by people like A.J. Ayer and the logical positivists, and the kind of philosophy, in particular, the kind of moral philosophy that was being done at the time was basically saying there's no basis for objective morality. It is it's just what you think is right, what you like, what you don't like. So it's a kind of emotivism, and these women thought this was just not true, and B, not adequate to the circumstances that were going on with the discovery of what was happening in concentration camps and what was happening in the Second World War more widely. Is it really just all we can say about morality or the way we should live or what it means to be a human being is that it's just what you feel? And they believed very passionately this was not enough. And the book is called Metaphysical Animals because that's what they became associated with, this idea. It's a kind of, it's a corrective. It's not just a description. It's, no, we are metaphysical animals, unless you consider the metaphysical as well as the physical, and unless you consider that there are real meanings in the world and truths and falsehoods, then what is philosophy for? It's just academic playing. And they became very influential, and they're famous names, these 4 women. But it's the first time I come across the story of the 4 of them and how revolutionary they were in I think, resetting Western philosophy, which they did. But the idea, the poetic phrase, metaphysical animals, just really got to me as well. So there's a poem in the book that's called that, called Metaphysical Animals, but also the ideas behind that. The idea is that even though I don't know how you would write about spirituality. I've never known what that means. But I do know how you can write about the body and the physical world in a way that pushes at the boundaries of that and doesn't diminish what might be the fullness of that. So I guess that became an influence as well.
Yeah, that's great, isn't it? Because it doesn't sort of privilege one over the other.
No.
We are animals,
exactly,
but we are metaphysical animals.
It's not a denial.
Yeah.
They were not denying the significance of our embodiedness. In fact, they're completely underlying, but that doesn't just mean we're flesh.
Yeah, and I guess in a not dissimilar way, I mean, I'm just thinking about when you are influenced by another poet, another writer, that you often kind of, when you take a big draft of that poet in, you often get someone who influenced them as well.
Yes.
And it seems to me in your book that Walt Whitman, who was hugely important to Lawrence, gets in there as you kind of drink deep of Lawrence. And, you know, I'm wondering whether you consider him one of the presiding spirits, because he's also kind of got this kind of holistic sense of belonging, of everything being part of one fabric, of a kind of holiness that resides in the physical.
I hadn't thought of that, but yes, I do love Whitman, and I probably did. awaken that love of Whitman through Lawrence without realizing it. But they both, what Lawrence got from Whitman was partly that sense of the physical universe is alive in a way that's more than just describable by the physical characteristics. But also they both have that confidence to take on the big subject, don't they? And sometimes it wrong foots them or trips them over, and sometimes it's extraordinary, but they take that risk. And I'm not putting myself in the same bracket as them at all, but there's something about that impulse to push and see what happens that I like, and also that felt maybe timely as well. So.
Yeah. Do you want to read us a few more poems?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Costa. Thank you. So this is the poem called Metaphysical Animals. At first light, night workers fumble on doorsteps for their house keys, let themselves back in, already half asleep. Twin magpies comb the lawn in lockstep. Magnolia in the park has gone full candelabra weeks too soon, petals tobacco-tipped. A trader in futures joins the silent choir, waiting for the day's first train. A scrub bush with no genus, self-seeded, unseen, scales the back wall of a house that will change hands this year in need of renovation. They have left the back door open. Now a redbreast drops in, stunned by the hallway's sudden dark, the cold stone floor. Its bold heart brings fire into the house, where a daughter washes her mother, unthinkable a year ago, by candlelight, music on the radio, skin blemished, watercolored, foxed. This is both grace and favor. Everything hurts, nothing will. So as the book went on, and I realized that there was a strand of elegies coming through it, I kind of owned up to that for myself and started making some of these elegies more conscious. This is one of them. It's called On Grace. Against the laws of physics, she has picked herself up in a Hessian sack to take the load off her legs. She has carried herself to all her old haunts. Her sack self, like a bone-bagged cat, warms her feet under the table. Everyone asks after her. The florist gives her bulbs, the baker crumbs. TVs she sees through other people's windows, screen familiar scenes, people long gone whose lives must be written down somewhere. A child she meets halfway across the painted iron canal bridge hands her an off-white cabbage rose as intricate as her wedding dress. Jackdaws in the plane trees, mummers, acting out everyday scenes from the other side. I'll read a couple more of the Mandelstam variables. I'll read one, hang on, let me just find the right one. I'll read one that has the dog star reference in it. Night, late. I wash my boots in the yard under a scatter plot of stars, too pale to catch on my watch face. I look up to trace the dog star, the only one I know. It's always true to me. No sign of it tonight. My own cur shivers at the door, his coat matted with mud and leaf mulch. I'm locked out. My keys dropped back along the path. No chance of finding them. I've walked an unplanned route for miles, my head up in the trees, triangulating futures, running through the sums. Besides, there's snow, aching to fall all day. It settles now. For the first time in my life, I feel worlds turn beneath my feet. And I'll finish this section with 3 kind of out-and-out elegies, I guess, or poems about my parents. So this one is called Taxonomy, and it's a poem about a strange thing that I've since realized happens to lots of people, where at the moment where I was with my mother on the night, me and my sister were there as she was dying, and we knew that was what it was going to be. I found myself unconsciously counting things, counting the roof tiles, counting how many slats there were on the blinds and the window. And it made sense for me of something I've never really understood in the Chekhov play Uncle Vanya, where at the end, when their lives are completely collapsed, they start doing the accounts. Why would you start doing the accounts? I can only figure from my own experience, it's about somewhere in the mind you're trying to take control of something you can't control, like someone dying. And therefore, the idea that if you reckon things up, you will be imposing some sort of structure, some sort of agency, which is, of course, an illusion. So this is called Taxonomy. The night you died, I was counting on the drive to you how many houses still had lights on in the small hours, adding up the digits on their gates and doors. Then ceiling tiles above your deathbed. We knew it was that as soon as we saw it. From door to window, wall to wall, to calculate the total in the room. But none of this contained my grief. So since that night, I broke the world down into categories, subsets. All the trees no longer simply trees, but broadleaves, needles, those that weep. Bird song sorted into falsetto trills, then coos, then caws, then twist again and map the riffs, the skittish loops. I kept a list of fallen leaves, of the hours I slept at night. I kept a note of times the first and last cars of each day took the hill towards the pass. I spent a year in the seed merchants where your granddad worked and counted every seed that came in, every seed that went out in a paper bag. The staff and customers were dead a century ago, the seed shop now a bar. It was not that counting helped at all, just that it mattered. I set out in a coal boat on the Irish Sea, which went down in a storm and took your great-grandfather with it. And I counted all the cod, hake, pollock, sand eels, dogfish, skate, all the uncaught. When all relevant lists were made, I called it quits. The trouble with these counts was that as soon as one was done, its reckonings were overrun. So now I count my squandered, restless days and print each new one bold before I lose the look of it. The last book has various elegies to my father, but this one snuck into this book because we discovered a bottle of gentian liqueur, which had been around for decades because no one could drink it. Gentian liqueur. Translucent with a taint of rheum. Gift from a friend in Germany. My father took it as a joke, offered round at Christmas or to visitors while he stuck to his scotch. A shot glass of this hard, clear draught, then watch their faces as its distillate of dark, of alpine nights, slipped down like bitter honey, then the coughing. A decade since he fell into the past, their house now cleared to make way for the living. This half-gone bottle stands at the back of our fridge, lid sealed shut, untouched, undrinkable. What is it holding there? Some anti-light before the full light comes. A blue so dark it reads as clear, counterweight to the furnace we saw through the curtain. And I'll finish with the poem about 11s, which wasn't about 11s as it turned out. This is in 11 sections. That I did hold on to. And it's in memory of my mother. And the 11 sections run through and they each have references to numbers. There is a kind of numerology in it, but essentially it's an elegy. And it's full of animals and plants, as this book is. So I'll just read these short sections without pausing too much between them. Elliptics. 1. Full tilt towards infinity. 11 hounds track the earth's sharp curvature. No bobtail pelt of hair, no halt of wounded deer. Not in pursuit, just muzzle down and go as the world turns towards them. Dusk that never blossoms, endless vespers. 2. Night-long drive. The road one step ahead. Picture flowers by your bed. Decker-petaled, heart-leafed arnica. Child's drawing of a sun. Full butter, sweet corn. Wake up to a morning curtains cannot hold. World out there for which we have no words. 3. Houses dark and steep, oblivious. Their street numbers and names half lit on gates. 3, 5, 7, 9, now run out into fields. Love alone brooks resurrection. Nothing else withstands its blaze. A lock that picks itself. 4. Under our feet, below the sewers, held by ligaments of a nameless stream, a doctor fish heals itself. Scarred tench stutters into heartbeats, ons and offs, ones and zeros, hum. After winter's stasis, this is life as bulb on the blink, burnt out filament, arcing from silt to float downstream. Now you become a shoal of 4, 6, 8. And how salt, how singular, how like the sea you are. 5. 7 swans in grief, alight on 7 highways, mistaking them for rivers. Cars schooling and shoaling. Pedestrians as trees weep on the banks. Blue lights scale the undersides of bridges. 6. Wildfires on the bare hills. 3 blackbird pairs on startle in their gardens. 7. Like a bird that has hit glass, like a rinse-through, freeze-dried version of yourself, like a loose suit of you that nobody checked if you wanted to wear, the wire wool of your hair, pipe cleaner fingers in a glove of skin, not knowing what realm you're in. 8. Be quiet, you say. Beyond these walls is so much silence. Damned if I can hear it. 9. On the way, I reckoned up trios of street lamps so as not to be outfaced by multiples. Every time I thought of you, I lost my thread and had to start again. 10. Rooks wake, warn, and clatter. Bees like loose wires under roof tiles. The long gone and the not yet here have better things to do than pay attention to this room. But if they did, they would, 11, know this as the punctum, where love can be undone or done, can be undone or done.
That's really beautiful. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the evening, the publication of Dog Star coincides with this paperback, this really rather beautiful paperback edition of Quartet for the End of Time, which has the subtitle On Music, Grief and Birdsong. Birds again. He's all about the birds at the moment. So these two books, we're lucky enough to have them together and to be able to think of them side by side. And there is a lot of common ground between them. There are lots of correspondences between them. This is a work of nonfiction. It's multi-stranded. One of the strands is, as Michael's already said, I think, Oliver Messiaen, the composer, and his piece Quartet for the End of Time, which gives a kind of structure to the book, and but it's much more than that, because it reflects a lifelong love of that piece of music and engagement with it. I say love, but also a kind of frustration and a whole lot of other emotional responses. So that's one of the things that's going on in this book. But alongside that and interwoven with it is another strand, a strand we might call memoir. I'm going to use that word. And I'm wondering, since there is some overlapping subject matter between these two books, particularly in relation to grief and loss, how you feel they relate to each other, or more, perhaps more, is that how are there different ways in which you can deal with this kind of subject matter in poetry and in prose? Are there things that you can do in a book like this which you can't do in a poem?
That's tricky. Are there things you can do that you can't do in a poem? Depends what you mean by things. There are tones you can explore. There are, and it's not that they can't be done in poem. It's maybe they can't be done in your poems. So maybe, I should be asking you this because you've just written a brilliant new book of poems which is coming out, and a brilliant non-fiction book, and they talk to each other as well. So I think for me it was quite liberating. I've worked in prose before. I've written 2 novels in the distant past, and more recently, this is the 3rd book of non-fiction. I think that there are tones, sort of. It's hard to describe, really. It's a different sort of voice. I think closer to the way I would talk about these things if I was talking about them, the prose voice. The poetry feels like it is me speaking, but it's in dialogue with the shape of the poem, and the shape of the poem has a bearing on the voice in the poem. And I don't think I've never felt that was limiting. I do feel that poets can do anything in poems. But for me, there are things I can do in poems that I can't do in prose. Maybe they would feel too undefended, to use that word that we've talked about before. This is the great poet Denise Riley once told me she wanted to move towards a stage where her poems were more and more undefended. And I think that's a brilliant image and aspiration for a poet. So there's something about pushing towards being undefended in poems. And prose just feels like a different enterprise for me. It is, I think, it's defended in different ways, defended by wit and undercutting itself and so on. It feels like a different language, I guess. Having said that, there are poems in Quartet for the End of Time. So at various points I found myself dropping in poems, not written specifically for this book, but written about some of the themes that were part of the making of Dog Star, I guess. So Elliptics, the poem I've just read, is also in Quartet for the End of Time. But Yeah, I'm sorry, that's a rambling answer, but I found that quite hard to answer in a clearer way. I don't think either is limited. There's extraordinary poetic writing in prose, and there's everything can be done in poetry, every tone struck. But I think for me, they enable different sorts of tone, and so I quite enjoy the friction of working on them both at the same time, so you can kick off or against one and go to the other.
Yes, yes. And
Do
of course...
do you find
yeah,
that?
I do, very much so. And of course, there's also just the question of space.
Yeah.
You have the space in a book
Yeah.
like this to go back and, you know, to explore something and to interrogate it at length.
Yes.
Which...
It's odd for a poet, that, isn't it? Because you find yourself, you're thinking, how long is this?
Yes.
This is massive.
Yeah, and really, really difficult when you're working on it, because you get used as a poet to being able to look at the whole thing
Yes.
on one page, usually.
Yes.
So, yes, you feel kind of
Yeah.
constantly lost back and forth through these immense documents. Yeah, I totally relate to that. And I'm interested, this is a final question really, before we maybe get you to just read a little bit from Quartet, and then there's a chance for other people to ask a question. I'm interested in this idea of being undefended, and on whether you think that you've kind of already implied that maybe you do think you're on a bit of a journey in that direction. I mean, I remember with your previous book, Ransom, which is 5 years ago,
Something
maybe.
like that. Yeah.
You know, there was an elegy in there for your father, I think called Episodics.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
I remember when I read that, thinking, this is new, or this is a kind of, it's a new voice. It feels more emotionally open. Maybe it takes that kind of loss and that kind of grief to kind of get us to that point. But you've already talked about irony and the kind of, the sort of contemporary reliance on irony in poetry. You know, there is a particular poet who shall remain nameless of the generation younger than us, who has quite famously said, well, I'm sorry, but all the sincerity was used up. It was used up before we came along. So there's, we're in a climate where irony is layered onto emotion in poems, often, not always, but, it feels as though that's where we are. But it seems to me that you've kind of peeled away some layers or something as you've gone along, and that both these books are part of that process. Would that seem right to you?
In some ways, but it's really complicated, isn't it? Because I actually think there's less of that masking, irony, self-defensive stuff now than there was in the 80s and 90s, where it was just universal. And it went along with a sort of doctrine that there weren't really any truths outside the poem. So everything was in a kind of postmodern hall of mirrors. And so poetry was ultimately about play and not much else. But that was a while ago now, and I think it's different. I think partly, there are political imperatives. The world demands that there are values and there are things and truths that you have to talk about. And the ecological crisis was driving that, and there are all sorts of, wars and tragedies going on which poets want to respond to. So I don't think, much as there's still a bit of kind of masking around, I don't think that irony being the sort of strongest note in British poetry is true anymore. But I do think there's a responsibility on all poets, and probably not poets, probably all writers, to question themselves as to whether they are giving it the full, giving it the full pitch, really trying to, and I wouldn't say what you mean, because you don't know what you mean until you've said it. I think more to be as absolutely starkly honest about yourself as well as about what you're writing about as possible. And it seems to me that's quite hard to do, and most poets don't do it. In the end, you get captivated by your own voice, and you sort of, you half give yourself away and then you half don't. And I'm not talking about confessional modes necessarily. I'm not talking about you have to write about your life directly and spill all the beans. That's a simplistic view of it. I think when Denise Riley is talking about undefended, she means really take the poem where it wants to go and allow it to be serious about it. And that's not that there isn't wit in it, but it's about trying not to continually pull the rug out from under your own poems in case people think you're being too portentous or pretentious or overly serious, and taking the risk of actually pushing right up against those things. So I think it's, and she does that brilliantly, book by book, I think, which is why so many other poets go back and back to her work. So I think we're in interesting times when people are more open to that, I think. Poets are more open to that. And I'm just pushing, like everybody else, to try to get to the nub of it. But there's a line that I always remember from those famous Paris Review interviews with every poet under the sun, and they're still going. This American journal called the Paris Review interviews poets about how they make poems and fiction writers about how they write fiction. And there's an interview with Robert Graves, the poet, and at the end of the interview, Robert Graves, who's quite very eccentric in many ways and fascinating, he says, words to the effect of, the reason we write the next poem is because we keep failing, which is a familiar, Beckett has a famous quote, doesn't he? But he said, if the perfect poem was written, the world would end, which is quite a good way of putting it. So he said, until then, we keep on trying to write it. So no one's ever written it, but you keep pushing at it, because if you knew what you were going to say and then you said it, and you said it in a brilliant way, in a poem that was brilliant and complete, and you couldn't see any reason for writing the next one because you'd done it, you'd be wrong. and also you probably should stop at that point because you're not trying hard enough. So I think we're all pushing, and being undefended is part of that effort, I think.
Yeah. And the word risk seems really key here. And I think these are both risk-taking books in the best possible way. Beautiful risk-taking books. If you haven't already got copies of them, I know they're here at the back of the room. Please do buy them. I'm sure Michael will be happy to sign them. Well, I'm making a big assumption there. I think he'll be happy to sign them, and also to chat about them. There'll be a bit of time at the end. It would be good to offer people the chance to ask a question, but do you want to read a little bit from Quartet before we do that?
Sure, I can do. So, thanks, Martin. Quartet for the End of Time, for those who don't know, is by the French mystic, modernist, very strange composer from early mid-20th century. And I discovered him in a record shop when I was a student, when I was looking for the usual stuff I was collecting, which was basically a list of bands. And I noticed there was this section called Contemporary Classical. And I didn't know there was such a thing as Contemporary Classical, that anyone was still doing it, really. But so I had a quick flick through, and there was this one titled, and in my very rudimentary French, I could see that the title was Quartet for the End of Time. Why would you not buy that? I mean, I had to hear what he meant by that. And I listened to it, and it's so strange. And then the more I read about it, the more obsessed I got with this. There are times since when I have not listened to it for a year or more, and then I go back to it. And so the book, in a sense, is about that piece. It's also about the circumstances of its writing. He wrote most of it in a labour camp, as I was saying, in Görlitz during the Second World War, to be played by the only 4 instruments that they could get hold of in the camp with anyone to play them. And it's still performed very widely, and it's about the end of time and what happens beyond the end of time. It's nothing if not ambitious, and it's very undefended as well. So it's a magnificent piece of music, a very famous piece of music. So I decided after all these years I ought to write about it and why I find it frustrating and why I find it fascinating. But it's also about how a great work of art, which that is, can stay with you and you see it in different lights and relate to it differently as you get older and change as well. So I'll read a few sections which are a bit about the work itself, and then a little bit at the end just about the first time I ever heard it, which was in the course of writing this book. I'd avoided listening to it for decades, and then I heard it in Manchester, played live. Visionary or nonsense? All the noise surrounding the quartet makes it inconceivable as a soundtrack to stick on in the background while you're queuing for a drive-through or worrying about your overdraft. You won't be whistling it in the street unless you're a bird. Part of that surrounding noise is the composer's account of its inspiration, themes, and scriptural sources, its reputation as a work of mystical power. The noise also includes the story of the premiere with its message of resilience and hope at one of the 20th century's bleakest moments. Visionary is a word to be wary of, especially when applied to an artist, but in this case, it's hard to avoid. Quartet evokes a vision of the future, but it's a future that lies beyond death, beyond time, beyond any aspect of this world. Messiaen was literally visionary too. His synesthesia meant seeing sounds not just as static colours, but a dazzling, shifting kaleidoscope, which he explained in notes to accompany his compositions. The list he attached to a later piece called Colours of the Celestial City includes the sounds of yellow topaz, red stained with blue, mauve, amethyst, violet, orange, sapphire, milky white, grey, rose, and emerald. I've always found these colour guides to music read like exotic standalone poems, albeit adding nothing whatsoever to my ears-only reception of his work. When you factor in his belief that birdsong is literally the unfallen music of the Garden of Eden, and his claim that the quartet contains passages of song transcribed from blackbirds and nightingales, it's not hard to see how some listeners might, and do, find it all a bit much. I'll skip now because I'm aware of time. I'll read you the bit about the premiere. So, for all these years, I'd avoided actually hearing it because I guess I felt it was mine and didn't want to give it away. I see a notice that the Manchester Collective is playing the quartet as part of a tour they're calling The End of Time, with the quartet as its centrepiece. The tour finishes back home in the Northwest, so I book a ticket to hear the complete Quartet for the End of Time played live in the Stoller Hall in Manchester for the first time. There's a programme note that says, if you're familiar with this work, you know what all the fuss is about. If it's your first time, you've got a hell of a ride ahead of you. It was a hell of a ride to the Stoller Hall too. My local stopping train into the city centre stopped too much and got in late. I got a taxi only to find much of the city centre cordoned off. The Chanel show had come to Manchester, do you remember that? With a street in the northern quarter turned into a catwalk for the night. Kate Moss, or a lookalike, had been papped in the Ancoats branch of Aldi that morning. Rock and movie stars were gathering to look at the frocks paraded by models, to a Mancunian playlist of Joy Division, New Order, and The Fall. I would have gone out of my way to hear what the late Mark E. Smith made of it all. The city was gridlocked. It was absolutely chucking it down too. I didn't want to get out and walk because the rain were biblical and I'd be sitting in my own steam for the quartet. At the end of the final section, having delivered us into eternity beyond the end of time, the musicians held still and the lights were kept down for what felt like minutes. The hall was full, all ages. At the start, there was a lot of coughing and spluttering, some of it mine, which is no surprise on a wet night in December. By the end, we could have held that silence for an hour, 2 hours. Nobody wanted to break it. When the lights came on, they were followed by encores and ovations. I felt foolish for waiting all these years to hear the quartet live. There were things I'd never noticed from recordings. The way the clarinet in Abîme des Oiseaux, Abyss of the Birds, can fill a huge hall and make it sound like an abyss. The way some parts I thought were violin were for the cellist and vice versa. The way he doesn't need to bring in an onde martineau. That's a really strange space age instrument that he pioneered the use of. Because he can make any instrument become an onde martineau. But above all, when played as well as this was, the way this piece can begin in Stalag 8A, his prison camp in Silesia, and end in a vision of eternity so real we can believe it, perhaps even touch it.
I too have become aware of time, the end of time, nearly, because it's 10 to 8. So I'm going to suggest actually that if you've got a question for Michael, you just ask him as we mill around with our glasses of wine and brightly coloured cupcakes. An odd combination, but I'm sure some of us will really enjoy them. Buy a book. Buy a book. Get it signed. And do put your question to Michael that way. I think that's probably best now at this stage. But I would just like to thank you, Michael, for sharing parts of both of those books and for being so generous with your time and your thinking and your responses to my questions. It was really wonderful to hear the work and to hear your thoughts about the making of it. So thank you very much, and thank you all for listening.